Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Current Consulting Group and sponsored by DrugPak. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled From Risks to Readiness, Preparing Your Drug Testing Program for 2026. Today's webinar qualifies for one continuing education credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attend in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for that credit. Once again, today's sponsor is DrugPak. DrugPak has been a trusted name in the industry for over 35 years. When it first launched, it was the only comprehensive drug testing management software available. As the drug testing industry has evolved, so has DrugPak. At the forefront of innovation, DrugPak processes data faster and more efficiently. By integrating directly with laboratories and MROs, it helps transform the way business is done in drug testing, making it easier for providers to deliver results to their clients. Today, DrugPak is web-based, mobile-enabled, customizable, and fully scalable to meet the needs of any drug testing program. The DrugPak team is passionate about creating software solutions that support the industry's diverse and evolving needs. Please stick around, as later in the presentation, we'll be showcasing all the amazing features of DrugPak, a vendor-agnostic platform built to support a wide range of testing programs. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group.
Well, thank you very much, Greta, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. I want to start out by giving a shout out to DrugPak. We're grateful for their sponsorship of webinars here in 2025 and the ones that we'll do in 2026. I've been associated with DrugPak for many, many years. I knew of them long before I ever started doing any kind of consulting work for them, but they're a brand. When you think about the drug testing industry, there are some iconic brands. There are a lot of great brands, and some of them are relatively new compared to how long DrugPak and Quest and others have been in the industry. But DrugPak is clearly one of the iconic brands in our industry. And I'll talk more about what they provide a little bit later in today's presentation. This is the agenda that we're going to follow, but I invite you to ask any questions that you have about drug testing, about drug testing legislation in 2025, what to expect next year, anything to do with drug testing, or how you might benefit from working with DrugPak. Happy to answer those questions for you. There's just so much going on in the drug testing world right now, with the ongoing legalization of marijuana, with the introduction of new and improved methods of drug testing. Just this is really sort of the golden age of emerging technologies. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that today. The first thing we're going to do, though, is talk about 2025 state legislation trends. And as I go through that, I will be weaving in some thoughts and ideas about what to expect in 2026. This has been a very active year. Usually from year to year, we at the Current Consulting Group will see anywhere from 400 to well over 500 bills introduced at the state level that, if enacted, would have a direct impact on workplace drug testing. And 2025 was no exception to that. Hundreds of bills introduced. Now, they don't all get passed. They don't all get enacted in the year that they're passed. But there's a lot of activity, and the total volume of bills at the state level tells us that this topic is something that lawmakers are looking at, their constituents are asking about. There's a lot of money out there on the lobbying side. The marijuana cannabis lobby is very powerful, very well funded, and so you see a lot of marijuana related bills introduced at the state level, even in states that have already legalized it. And that's one of the leading trends. Now, another one is a trend toward voluntary drug testing programs. I'll explain what that is in a little bit in our presentation. And also new and emerging specimens for testing, new technology. Now, some of these have been around a long time, but they're just starting to catch on at the state level in terms of bills introduced to add the use of a particular testing method or specimen to an existing law. You have to keep in mind that most state drug testing laws, not all of them, but many of them, the majority of them, were written 25, 30 years ago at least. The first drug testing laws at the state level I can remember were probably from, the mid 80s, maybe around 87, where some states were starting to pass state laws, legislation to govern workplace drug testing practices. And then it's just been sort of, there was a flurry of them from 87 into the 90s. And then it settled down a little bit. And today we're dealing with laws that were written, as I say, 25, 30, 35 years ago. And you're seeing legislation introduced that modifies those laws to sort of reflect all the changes, all the developments, all the technology that's now available. So you see oral fluid testing legislation in a state that didn't allow it because 25, 30 years ago, it really wasn't a very common thing. Now we're starting to see that. And I'll share some of that stuff with you as we go through today's presentation. But let me take you through some examples of some noteworthy legislative changes from 2025. So in Minnesota, now Minnesota has a mandatory drug testing law, meaning everybody in the state that does drug testing must comply with that mandatory law. There have been some changes to that law or changes to their marijuana laws that have a direct impact on that law, as well as on general practices when it comes to workplace drug testing. So in 2025, new medical cannabis protections were put into place. This is something that we're seeing in a lot of states. These are states that have already legalized marijuana, but now the next phase in the pro-marijuana movement is to get these laws to provide greater protections for medical marijuana users. And eventually what we'll see down the road, we're already starting to see it, are greater protections for anybody who uses marijuana for any purpose. We call those recreational or adult use laws, where marijuana is not tied necessarily to a medical condition, but just because the person wants to smoke marijuana or they want to use marijuana products. And so in Minnesota, we saw legislation passed that puts in place some pretty strict written notice requirements before an employer can take any adverse action based on a marijuana related incident or a positive drug test for marijuana. And keep in mind also, and I don't mean to offend anybody's sensibilities on this, but I still use the word marijuana usually. A lot of these laws, and this is very common, and it is the case in Minnesota, will refer to it as cannabis, okay? That's sort of the politically correct word to use. I still fall back into the use of the word marijuana. In fact, I just finished writing a book called What Every Employer Should Know About Marijuana. And so I still tend to use that word, but cannabis is really sort of the word that's in vogue. It's the politically correct word, has more of a positive connotation, generally speaking, than marijuana does. But in Minnesota, they passed a law, and employers are required to give employees who test positive for marijuana 14 days notice before they can take any adverse employment action. So this is another sort of element of protecting the marijuana user, in this case, medical marijuana users, okay? So it prevents discrimination, or it puts in place protections that would minimize and hopefully eliminate their intent to eliminate discrimination against medical cannabis users who are enrolled in a state program or cannabis positive test results, unless the employer can show that there was some impairment involved in whatever triggered the drug test. Now, a drug test alone doesn't prove scientifically or legally that a person was impaired, but some other evidence, maybe a documented history of aberrant behavior, maybe there's an impairment test itself, which I'll talk about that technology in today's presentation. Some other evidence of impairment that would give the employer some justification for taking adverse employment action prior to the end of the 14 days. So very important to note in Minnesota, right? I think this probably signals a trend or a continuing trend toward employee cannabis protections expanding and becoming more prevalent. As I mentioned, states that have already passed and legalized marijuana, they've already passed legislation to legalize it either for medical or recreational use or both. And now the next phase is, on the lobbying side, is to get more protections for individuals, for users into those laws. So I think we can expect more states to restrict, not necessarily prohibit, but to restrict pre-employment testing for marijuana. I'm going to share an example of that on another jurisdiction coming up. And also the second bullet in the second part there, penalties based solely on THC positive results, meaning states that would require, in addition to a positive test for marijuana, some other evidence of impairment. And this may introduce more impairment-based frameworks. And again, I'm going to talk about that in more detail coming up. Now, Ohio has for years had a voluntary drug testing program in place. These are states that have laws that only apply to companies that voluntarily choose to participate in whatever the program is in that state, where in many cases, like here in Florida where I live and in Ohio, there's some type of tie-in to a discount or reimbursement of funds spent on workers' compensation insurance. So in Ohio, unlike Florida and Georgia and Tennessee and several other states with these kinds of laws, they have a tiered approach to that discount program. There's 4 compliance tiers, and the highest tier has a 7% year-end bonus and a reimbursement of up to $5,000 for qualified costs. This is in place to incentivize employers to participate in the program, drug test according to the requirements of the program, and then qualify to get these benefits. They're, discounts on workers' comp premiums, or as in the case of Ohio, a reimbursement of up to $5,000. Now, here's the catch. All 4 of the tiers in the new Ohio Super Program, that's what I call it, SUPR program, they all require pre-employment testing, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, return to duty, and follow-up testing, as you see at the bottom. They also require the employer to have a written policy and to provide supervisor training on the signs and symptoms of substance abuse and employee drug education. So, as I said, you're required to drug test a certain way and to have a program in place that meets the requirements of the state in order to qualify for the benefits that they're offering. Here in Florida, for example, if my company chose to participate in the voluntary program, then I would theoretically qualify for a 5% discount on my workers' comp premiums. It's different from state to state that have these programs in place. And what's unique about Ohio is that they have this 4-tier program where the benefits increase as you do more as required by the state in terms of the drug-free workplace program and drug testing. Will we see more of those? Perhaps, right? It's been in place in Ohio for many years under a different program with different types of discounts being offered. But Ohio's really sort of out there on their own when it comes to this type of program. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see more states do something like this. Keep in mind that you have these voluntary state laws and they only apply to the companies that are in those voluntary programs. Outside of the voluntary program here in Florida, there are very few restrictions or conditions placed on employers when it comes to workplace drug testing. So we may see more of this type of Ohio model, but it's hard to predict at this time because of the legalization of marijuana and the restrictions being put on testing for marijuana and adverse employment action for testing positive for marijuana. That might have an impact. Now, Alaska is a state also with a voluntary drug test law. They're unique in that in 2024, late in 2024, they updated the language of their voluntary law to specifically permit the use of oral fluid drug testing. Now, so now you've got your choice of urine, breath, or oral fluid up in Alaska. And that again is part of their voluntary drug testing program. It's an indicator that among the emerging technologies, and I always refer to oral fluid testing as the ultimate emerging technology because it's been around a long time, but it's the only other drug testing technology or method that has been approved for use within the federal government testing of its own federal employees. And there are now DOT regulations that are pending for lab-based oral fluid testing. So I think we're seeing growing acceptance, especially at the state level, for oral fluid testing, a lot of it based on what we're seeing at the federal level. And I think we can expect to see more of that type of legislation going forward, where old laws that just refer to urine testing are now being updated to specifically refer to oral fluid testing. This is what happened last year in Minnesota, where they have a, a laboratory licensing law that really made it sound like you could only do urine testing, but they updated that law to specifically allow rapid result or point of collection testing using oral fluid. So that was a big development, in 2024. And now we see Alaska doing this in 2024, but applied to 2025. Now, let's talk about Nebraska and the city of Pittsburgh. In Nebraska, voters voted to legalize medical marijuana. So that's yet another state that has approved medical marijuana. We're waiting for the details on that. Lots of these medical marijuana laws will have workplace-specific language or provisions in them. We didn't see that in the Nebraska law. It's something I would expect to see added to it in the near future, because employers are affected by these types of laws when medical and recreational marijuana laws are passed. In the city of Pittsburgh, though, we see very, very strict conditions when it comes to anything to do with medical marijuana patients. And so it prohibits most pre and post hiring for marijuana when it's tied to patient status. Pittsburgh's not the only city to do this. We see kind of similar language in Philadelphia, Atlanta. I think Atlanta's applies to government employees, but we see this not just at the state level, but at the city level. Now, New York had passed a very restrictive city ordinance against marijuana testing. Later, the New York State Department of Labor put out provisions that sort of trumped that city ordinance in terms of the restrictions. And it was actually even more restrictive. Now, in a lot of these states and municipalities, there'll be exceptions for safety-sensitive workers, for firefighters, for police officers, et cetera. You just have to look at each one individually. But Pittsburgh is a very, very strict city ordinance when it comes to not being able to test for marijuana within the city limits. So at this stage, I think we'll see more municipal level regulations coming out, probably marijuana specific. We'll see an increase in anti-discrimination protections for medical marijuana users. And most states, as I mentioned, will restrict employer testing for marijuana except for safety-sensitive workers. Now, the question that becomes, excuse me, what is a safety-sensitive worker? Who defines which positions are that qualify as a safety-sensitive position? And in most states, the state laws don't define what a safety-sensitive position is. They really don't even sort of skirt around the issues, the edge of the issue. So it's really up to employers in most cases to define that. I'm not a lawyer. I can't give legal advice. Here at the current consulting group, we don't give legal advice, even though we have attorneys on staff. But I would say be very, very careful as you define safety-sensitive roles. Be reasonable about it, and make sure that you're complying with the with the applicable marijuana laws in either the states or municipalities where you have business operations. Going forward, review and, if necessary, update your policy in these states and municipalities that I've talked about today. I suggest you update your drug testing policy every year, because there's, especially if you're a multi-state employer, because there are constant changes, especially prompted by legal marijuana and especially medical marijuana laws that apply in your state. Look for more oral fluid testing, and if it fits your workplace, if it's a good match for you, excuse me, maybe add it to your program or your policy. Excuse me, I'm battling a little bit of a cold, and so I'm going to talk while I suck on a throat lozenge at the same time. Okay, so Greta, let me turn it over to you for our first poll question.
Thank you, Bill. And for our first poll question, I'm going to go ahead and launch that. How prepared does your organization feel for the upcoming 2026 drug testing changes? Very prepared, somewhat prepared, not prepared, not sure yet. Please go ahead and pick one of the options available. I will give everyone a few seconds to participate, and as always, we appreciate your participation. Okay. Everyone has voted. I will share the results. 33% said very prepared, 57% said somewhat prepared, 0% said not prepared, and 10% not sure yet. I will go ahead and close that. It's back to you, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Greta. And I'm glad it was 0% that said they're not prepared for next year. But if you need help, if you have questions, contact one of your, the person that you deal with at DrugPack or your current consulting group, and we'd be happy to answer questions for you. And again, I invite you to ask any questions that you'd like to ask today. Just put it into the chat function there on the screen, and Greta will be asking me questions at the end. Any we don't get to, we'll respond to in writing. Now, I'm going to talk about some results from 3 major reports that come out every year. One is the Quest Drug Testing Index, which is a report that comes out from Quest Diagnostics, and invite you to visit their website if you'd like more information. There's a source at the bottom of this first slide that you could use to do that. A lot of great information there. We'll also be talking about some results from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that comes out from the federal government, and then a few slides from a survey that we do every year, which is a survey of the drug testing industry on certain trends. And we'll go through all 3 of these, and you'll see how they tie into some of the legislation that we're looking at. Now, with the Quest Drug Testing Index, that report comes out usually I'm going to predict maybe by the middle end of summer. And it's a great report. It's been coming out for 25, 30 years, something like that, a long time. Quest does a great job with it, but they always identify certain trends that are sort of capturing the attention of employers or creating lots of questions. And in this year's, and keep in mind, this is the 2025 report, which is based on data from 2024. So there's about a 1-year lag time there. But a lot of it had to do with fentanyl, because we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in fentanyl use. And now we're starting to see, and that's across the country, but now we're starting to see it reflected in drug test results in the workplace. So look at that first slide there. Random test positivity for fentanyl is 707% higher than pre-employment positives for fentanyl. That indicates that people can lay off the drug when applying for a job, but eventually they start using or they turn to it again. Very dangerous trend there. Now, other drugs, so look at that second bullet there. Other drugs show lower or similar random or pre-employment positivity. Over the past 5 years, fentanyl positivity in random testing has been 400% higher than pre-employment testing, generally speaking. And 60% of fentanyl positive tests also contain other drugs. So we're talking about polydrug use increasing at a dramatic rate. In other words, people don't typically use fentanyl only. They're also smoking marijuana. They're also using other opioids, etc. And so when somebody tests positive for fentanyl, usually they'll be positive, or there'll be the presence of other drugs. Marijuana co-positivity rose from 10% in 2020 to 22% last year. We're seeing a lot more of that at the workplace level, of course. That first bullet, number 4, Quest notes increasing fentanyl use during active employment while people are working. That's reflected in post-accident and reasonable suspicion drug test results. Very interesting, right? Starting July of this year, HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, added fentanyl to the federal drug test panel. Now, DOT is sort of lagging behind on that, but that's an interesting development, right? Is fentanyl really a big problem? Is the government overreacting to it? I don't think so, but it's trickling its way into the non-government workplace drug testing practices around the country. Even though marijuana remains the #1 drug that people test positive for, we're seeing increases in other drugs, fentanyl being one of them, right? And then look at number 8, amphetamines trending upward. So we're seeing marijuana going up. Well, marijuana is really sort of level. but we're seeing amphetamines going up, cocaine and opioids either the same or going down. So the trends are fentanyl, amphetamine, marijuana. And then in the safety sensitive workforce, it shows lower overall positivity rates. Most of that's because those types of workplaces are and have been for many years subject to drug testing. So the deterrent impact of drug testing can be seen in sort of declining positivity rates over the course of many years. This is particularly true with DOT required drug testing, excuse me, where there are lots and lots of big differences between the positivity rate for pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion in DOT mandated testing versus non-DOT, where the DOT rates are much, much lower. Partly because it's the DOT covered employees are going to get tested. They know they're going to get tested, but the consequences are right there staring them in the face. If you test positive on a DOT drug test, you must be removed immediately from performing DOT safety sensitive functions. Okay, so you may have questions about the Quest Drug Testing Index. Happy to respond to those. Let's move on to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Now I only have a couple of slides here, but this report is just chock full of good information. You can go onto the government website and look at these reports, and you see the source down there on this slide. You're going to get all these slides in the recording, but you can go onto the website and you can find information broken down by states, by types of individuals, a lot of demographics in there. So I would recommend that you take a look at this. It's one of the most valuable reports that I comb over every year when it comes out. They break down substance abuse. Now, let me explain how this survey is conducted. So an individual will receive a phone call from somebody saying that they're doing a survey and would they like to participate. Then they're going to proceed to ask them questions about illicit drug use, alcohol use, smoking. Excuse me. What's interesting about that is that years ago the government did a survey. I don't want to call it a survey, but they issued a report on the accuracy of their survey. And this was a long time ago, but I think it's still applicable. They found that the results of the survey were about 1/3 lower than reality. In other words, people lie when somebody from representing the federal government calls to do a survey about their illegal drug use behavior. Not a big surprise, right? This slide shows past month use by drugs, and you can see the pattern there, the percentages: alcohol number 1, tobacco number 2, nicotine vaping, and then finally marijuana. Now on the next slide, it looks at past year illicit drug use. Now look at where marijuana is. People, a much higher percentage, a little over 64%, admit to using marijuana sometime in the last year, whereas in this previous slide, it was about 44% who admitted to using marijuana in the past month. There's also a category called lifetime use, and that's even higher. When somebody will admit, yeah, at some time in my life I did use marijuana, that's a higher percentage than the ones who will admit to having used it within the last 30 days of being surveyed. Lots of great information in this report, and if you like these kind of statistics, there's no end to the information that you'll find. Okay, so let's go on to our next poll question. Greta, take it over.
Thanks, Bill. For our second poll question, I will launch it. And the question is, which substance poses the biggest concern for your workplace right now? Marijuana, fentanyl, amphetamines, opioids, or others? I'll give everyone a few seconds to participate. Okay. And now I'll share the results. 60% said marijuana, 13% fentanyl, 13% amphetamines, 10% opioids, and 3% other. Okay, Bill, back to you.
Thank you, Greta. 13%, I think you said, were indicated fentanyl. That's interesting, right? Because 10 years ago, we wouldn't even have offered fentanyl as an option in this poll question. So pretty high percent indicating fentanyl is a concern. All right, so let's go on to some results from Current Consulting Group's 27th annual drug testing industry survey. Now, we do two surveys every year, one of the drug testing industry and one of employers. And so the results I'm going to share with you here are from our industry survey, which we've been doing every year for 27 years. So we asked people in the drug testing industry, which drug testing methods do you currently offer? No surprise, almost everybody mentioned lab-based urine testing, and a high percentage said point of collection or rapid result urine testing. Urine testing is still the #1 testing method used by employers and offered by drug testing professionals. But you can see pretty healthy percentages now offer oral fluid testing, either lab-based or rapid result, and a very healthy 70% offer hair testing. That doesn't mean that 70% of their clients are using hair testing, but 70% of drug testing providers offer hair testing as an option. So that'll give you kind of an indication of where we're at now. On this next slide, we ask the question, which drug testing methods do you anticipate offering in the future? Well, you're not going to see high percentages for lab-based or point of collection urine because most of them are already offering that, but there were some that are going to add it, right? Because there were, what was it, about 4%? Yeah, 4% that it didn't mention urine testing. But the two biggest ones, if you add them up together, and you can't really add them because it's not a quantitative survey, but lab-based oral fluid 26% and point of collection or rapid result oral fluid 22%. Now there could be some overlapping, right? Because if you add up all these percentages, it's not necessarily going to come out to 100%. But here's what's interesting. As we've done this survey over the years, we've seen the percentage of drug testing providers indicating that they're now going to offer oral fluid testing increase year over year for probably the last 5 or 6 years, ever since the federal government started really looking seriously at and signaling to the drug testing industry that they were going to add oral fluid testing to the regulations. 7% for hair, we're still not seeing movement at the federal level with hair testing, although there was at some point about 5 years ago. Breath THC, a technology that's really not sort of evolved yet. There's some providers out there. We're really waiting for a real usable point of collection THC test. But 17% also indicated that they're going to be offering some type of impairment identification exams or tests in the future. This is an interesting development, right? Because a lot of states with marijuana laws are requiring employers to indicate or provide some evidence of impairment to go along with the positive test result for marijuana. Now we're starting to see more interest in these impairment exams and tests are out there. A number of companies like Gaze and others, Predictive Safety, that are out there with this technology. There are different types of impairment tests. And that's what's fascinating about this. There's so much different technology out there for this. It's going to be interesting to see which methods really sort of rise to the top over the next say 3 to 5 years. I've been doing this for a long time, since 1989. I predict that we're going to see a lot more of impairment identification exams in the coming years. This is a growing area of employee screening and employee wellness. So anyways, very interesting to compare on this slide where everybody is right now, and on this slide, sort of the direction that we're going into. Now, another area of growth in the drug testing industry is point of collection or rapid result testing, which you can currently do with oral fluid or urine, and maybe in the future, breath. This is interesting. 64% predict that rapid result point of collection testing will increase over the next 3 years. Only 5% said it will decrease. 31% said it'll stay the same. You can see in the blue box where we were a year ago when we asked that same question. This is interesting because, again, going back to state laws, not all state laws permit rapid result testing for workplace. Most of them don't say anything about it. Maybe it's permitted by default that it's not in there. but most state laws written 25, 30 years ago, really before the advent of this technology, before the days of Roche Diagnostics with the test cup, which was really put point of collection, rapid result testing on the map. Those laws were written long before that. And so we're seeing states allow it, some states going back and modifying their drug test laws, like in Minnesota, to specifically allow point of collection oral fluid testing. So I think this is going to be a growing area in our industry, and it's really a reaction to some of the challenges that exist with drug testing today. In our employer survey that came out back in, what was it, September or October, we presented it at the SAPA conference. We present the results of our industry survey every year at the NDASA conference, and that's usually April timeframe. And then we share the results of our employer survey at the SAPA conference, which is usually September, but more recently in October. It'll be in October in 2026. And so when we do the employer survey, it's not the same results, right? Because we're talking to users of drug testing instead of sellers of drug testing. But you see a lot of interest, a growing interest in point of collection testing, because some of the challenges that exist with drug testing, according to the employer survey, are arranging for collections and getting results back in a timely manner, which is very important in today's highly contested job market, where employers are competing for the same job applicants, and whoever can get that result fastest and get a negative result and offer that person a job, what we call same-day job offers, has a competitive advantage when it comes to filling vacancies on their staff. So we'll see more point of collection testing here in the near future. I also want to add that when we ask the question, do you plan to offer, or do you currently offer non-drug testing and impairment screening, 13% said yes, compared to 14% the year before. 58% said no, compared to 61% the previous year. And 29% said no, but we're interested in learning more about it, compared to what we had 25% the year before. This is, as I mentioned before, this is a growing area of the drug testing industry. I think we'll see a lot more companies starting to offer, the drug testing providers offer impairment type of screening, and employers really asking for it, demanding it, because they're in marijuana laws, in marijuana states that allow the use of marijuana, but also require employers to add some evidence of impairment to a positive drug test result before they can take adverse employment action. So we've got 2 more sections to go. And again, I invite you to ask any questions that you'd like, but I want to talk about DrugPak for a minute. And as I mentioned, I consider the DrugPak brand one of the iconic brands in our industry. There's some really great up and coming brands out there, like Synergy, for example, has not been around nearly as long. Some others, Premier Biotech, sort of in that mid category. But then you have the brands that have been around 25, 30 years, like Quest and Abbott and DrugPak. And what's unique about DrugPak, and because there are other providers of software programs, management software, is not only was DrugPak first, and they were, as you can see on this slide, they were first in lots of different things that are really common in the industry now, but they were the first to develop the technology and to incorporate it into their software management, and then to be able to offer it as a usable technology to both employers as well as drug testing providers. And I use the word software, but most of DrugPak services are cloud-based now, or as you can see down there, the last one, first to use artificial intelligence, AI. They do a lot with AI as well, and that's really where everything's sort of going in that direction. Here at Current Consulting Group, we write drug testing policies, we provide state law information, and a lot of our programs we're converting to AI with the help of DrugPak. Now, I'm not saying we write drug testing policies that way, we don't, but we have lots of information that we store in our programs based on, AI helps us keep those up to date, and then our drug testing subject matter experts go in and make sure everything's accurate. But you're seeing a lot more AI-oriented consulting services and platforms out there. As I mentioned, DrugPak first to go in that direction. And I'm not going to go through all of this, point by point, but I do want to point out a couple of things. So in this one, their software, I'm using the word software again, it can be used by employers, by TPAs, by MROs, et cetera. It can be DOT or non-DOT regulated, or Nuclear Regulatory Commission, HHS, et cetera. It can be used to integrate ordering for drug tests, for physical exams, for background checks. You're seeing a big movement in our industry toward diversifying what drug testing providers offer in terms of not just a drug test, but physical exams and other occupational health exams, so that they're covering all the different screening services that an employer would need, as well as background checks. Now, I want to talk about that, and everything can be customizable. That's what I really like about DrugPak. But let me talk about that last bullet there, vendor agnostic. This is important. I asked the question, why is this important, right? Because you can integrate it with multiple labs or MROs, et cetera. As we progress in our drug testing program as an employer or as a provider of drug testing, you're moving around a lot, right? You're matching your client with the best external services that you have relationships with, so that you're offering the solution that that employer needs. And so that may require, using different labs or changing labs sometimes. Not suggesting that you have to do that. I'm just saying that you want that flexibility. And so being vendor agnostic gives you the advantage there that you need by doing that. And I mentioned the customization. Not every company is the same, and there may be different types of reports you want at this company versus that company, or with this client versus that client. You can do all of this with DrugPak software. So, and there's lots of different ways that you can subscribe to the service. So I'd really suggest that you get a hold of them, because there's a lot of different safe and secure things that go into place here. I'm not an expert on the technology, on the science side of it, but if you'd like to get a free demo, a guided tour, excuse me, that you can get a hold of DrugPak by using that URL there, or you can contact them directly by emailing them at sales@drugpak.com. I like the people over there. I think you'll like them too if you don't already work with them. If you do work with them, but you didn't know they offered some of the services that we talked about today, I suggest you make a phone call or go visit their website or email them, and you'll find that they're very easy to work with. Now, Greta, we have one more poll question, and then I'm going to take you through some things that you can do or you can help your clients do to mitigate the risk and remain compliant. But before we do that, Greta, let's do our last poll question.
Sure, Bill, thanks. For our last poll question, the question is, what areas of your drug testing program would benefit most from modernization or automation? And please choose as many of these that apply to you. Random program management, compliance tracking, supervisor training, reporting and oversight, multi-state policy alignment. Okay, and I'll go ahead and close a poll and share the results with everybody. 45% said random program management, 45% said compliance tracking, 28% said supervisor training, 38% said report and oversight, and 59% said multi-state policy alignment. And
well, I'm happy to see some of those results, that last one particularly with updating your policy, because that's what we're going to talk about first. We ask the question in our employer survey every year, when did you last update your drug testing policy? And unfortunately, it's a really unacceptable percentage, somewhere in the 30% that, and actually it was, take that back, it was something like 44% this year. But an unacceptable percentage that indicate they haven't updated their policy in many, many years, at least more than a year, 2 years, 3 years, or more than 3 years. That's troubling because, as you can see from today's presentation, there are state laws being passed every year that truly affect a workplace drug testing program. And so you have to keep your drug testing policy up to date on an annual basis. And that's something we can help you with the current consulting group if it's not something that you do, if you're not comfortable with that. Because one of the other things that you mentioned was being in alignment with state laws. As I talked about earlier, there's mandatory laws, there's voluntary laws, there's also case law, like in California, that really governs drug testing in that state. even in states that have mandatory or voluntary laws, there's case law about the mandatory law. And so you need to be aware of that, because if you're putting a program together for your client, or you're the end user, you're the employer, your policy has to reflect those. So for example, one of the most common questions I'll get asked by a company we're working with that's in multiple states is, which state law applies to us? Which do we base our policy on? The answer is all of them, because you must be in compliance with each state's unique and specific requirements. So and to do that, instead of writing 30 different laws because you're or policies because you're in 30 different states, we recommend addendums to the base policy for anything in a particular state that would differ from what's in your core base policy. So for example, you don't necessarily want to base your entire nationwide drug testing program on the conditions that apply in the most restrictive state you're in. In other words, you wouldn't want to write a policy for the whole country based on California's case law or New York's very restrictive drug testing laws. You want to add an addendum that only applies to your operations in those particular states, but leaves you free to do what you really want to do with your drug testing program in states like Florida and Texas and the Carolinas and Georgia, etc., where drug testing is permitted, and employers have the right to do lots of different things, lots of different good things that help them achieve their drug-free workplace objectives. That depends on the laws that apply. Workers' comp and unemployment comp regulations. Those exist in almost every state that have some, in many cases, very specific drug testing language that, under certain circumstances, allows employers to move to deny claims, a workers' comp claim or an unemployment comp claim based on a positive drug test result. There are states with industry-specific requirements, like in Illinois with public works contractors, or in some of the eastern states with mining industry requirements. And then, of course, all the conditions that come into play when it comes to medical and recreational marijuana laws. That all needs to be reflected in your policy. And because those types of laws, especially those marijuana laws, are constantly being updated and changed and passed, you want to update your policy every year, especially if you're in multiple states. Now, under the federal regulations, there's Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, there's the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, etc. They're all on the screen. Those don't change dramatically from year to year, but they can, right? If Part 40 gets changed, then you're going to have to make a change to your FMCSA policy, etc. Maybe. So you want to make sure that you get your DOT policies reviewed and, if necessary, updated from year to year. That's so important. Update your policy every year to reflect any changes in state laws and legislation or federal regulations. Lots of times, those state laws will require employers to provide some type of supervisor, what's called signs and symptoms training, so they can spot the signs of substance abuse in the workplace or any kind of aberrant behavior that might be related to substance abuse. Many states require that. The DOT regulations require it in most cases. And so you want to provide that training. That's something also that we can help you with through DrugPack if you don't have a training method in place already. And then communicating your program. If you make changes to your program, if you update your policy in any way significantly, you need to inform your employees so that they know as well, so that they can comply with the law. And then, by all means, please take those marijuana laws seriously, because you're required to comply with all of them in the states where you have business operations. And so you may be in a very restrictive marijuana law state like, say, New York, and maybe in another state that's legalized marijuana, but it's more employer friendly. And so you need to make sure that your policy reflects the different requirements in each of the states where you have business operations. But know this, that even in a state with a very restrictive marijuana law related to drug testing, all employers, and even in those states, have the right to prohibit employees from being at work under the influence of marijuana, bringing marijuana into the workplace, and using marijuana while on duty. You still have the right to do that, and you still have the right to hold individuals accountable if they break those policy laws. It may not be based on a positive drug test result, but you have the right to prohibit those things and hold people accountable. And that's one of the ways that you protect yourself in the event that something happens where somebody's harmed or property is damaged, etc. and you're facing a respondeat superior or negligent hiring law suit, you want to make sure that you have a policy in place that shows that you're making a good faith effort to keep your workplace safe. And you prove that through your policy and your drug testing program. So that's a lot of information. You're going to get these slides through the recording that Greta's going to send you. But Greta, do we have any questions we want to take care of before we close today?
Yes, we actually do, Bill. The first question, it says, with all the new protections around medical cannabis and the push toward impairment-based practices, how should we be adjusting our drug testing policies going into 2026?
Well, first of all, make sure your policy is up to date and that it reflects any requirements in the states where you have business operations. And then one of the things that we advise all clients, and we write hundreds of policies every year, one of the things that we advise all of our clients to do is make sure you have a dedicated marijuana section in your policy that specifically points out that you will comply with the marijuana laws that apply to your company, that you will not discriminate because these laws typically prohibit discrimination against medical marijuana users in particular, but that you're going to hold people accountable if they come to work under the influence of marijuana and cannot perform their job properly, especially if they're in a safety sensitive position. So my advice is have a dedicated marijuana section in your policy so it's very clear and easy for employees to see it and know what's required of them.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill. Somebody else made the comment that we're seeing more states and now the federal government support oral fluid testing. How do we know when to use oral fluid versus urine or another specimen type?
Yeah, a few years ago, we asked the question about which drug testing method will be most used. We asked it 2 years in a row in our drug testing industry survey. And the first time we asked the question, urine testing was number one, oral fluid testing was number two, but they were only separated by a few percentage points. I was kind of surprised. The next year when we answered it, 45% said urine and 45% said oral fluid. I think everybody's sort of coming to the conclusion that we're going to see a lot more oral fluid testing in the future. You want to make sure that's reflected in your drug testing policy as well. But where does it make most sense to use oral fluid? Oral fluid collections are very easy to conduct. It doesn't necessarily require a professional, but it should be overseen by a professional. And so in other words, employees can be trained to observe the process, right? Because you don't need bathrooms, you don't need to turn off the hot water, put blue dye in the toilets or anything like that. Very easy to do. And the real big differences, two main differences between urine and oral fluid is that with urine testing, drugs become detectable within minutes after usage, which makes oral fluid, did I say urine? Let me back up. With oral fluid testing, drugs become detectable within minutes after usage, which makes oral fluid testing ideal for situations where recent use detection is imperative. Say an employee comes back from a lunch break and reeks of marijuana, so there's reasonable suspicion. An oral fluid testing will likely come back positive, depends on the test you use, but will likely come back positive for marijuana if they used it within the last hour or maybe even within the last 30 minutes, because oral fluid testing detects the parent drug, not the metabolite. With urine, it takes about 6 to 7 hours before drugs become detectable in a urine sample, because with urine, you're detecting the metabolite of the drug, not the parent drug. So with recent use detection being a priority, oral fluid testing's the test that you want for that. The other big difference is the window of detection. With oral fluid testing, we're talking about a much shorter or tighter window of detection for drugs versus urine. One of the criticisms the pro-marijuana people have with urine testing is that drugs are detectable in a urine sample for weeks after usage. That's true. Probably not going to come up as a reported positive in most situations because the cutoff level won't match. But with oral fluid testing, you've got that tighter 24-hour window of detection for most drugs. And so you're going to know that the individual used drugs fairly recently, possibly if there's reasonable suspicion to suspect they were using, at the workplace or during their lunch break, et cetera. You're going to know that with an oral fluid test. So that's one of the reasons there's a return on investment value to oral fluid testing that sort of streamlines the process and makes it attractive from an ROI standpoint. And those are some of the reasons why DOT decided to issue final regulations for, or a final rule for oral fluid testing, lab-based oral fluid testing, not point of collection. But there's great value in the point of collection oral fluid testing as well, especially in like job markets where you're doing job fairs, for example. You want to make same-day job offers to 100 people. You can do that oral fluid test on site and get a result back within minutes. And the individuals, in most cases, going to test negative, and you're going to be able to offer them a job and put them to work that day if you want to. So there's a lot of advantages to oral fluid that I think are going to really push the industry in that direction.
Thank you, Bill. And our last question, we use oral fluid testing on many of our job sites. However, I have never ordered an oral test from a clinic. Are you seeing that more clinics are testing using oral fluids?
Absolutely. That's a growing area. You know, most companies offer it, but some of the big brands out there are really sort of leading the charge, where their OC health centers or the patient service centers, in the case of LabCorp and Quest, can offer at most of their locations oral fluid testing. So we'll see a lot more of that in the future, I believe.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, for a great presentation. Before we close out today's session, we want to thank all of you for joining us on behalf of the Current Consulting Group and DrugPak. We hope you found today's presentation informative and helpful. If you submitted a question, we will answer you offline. If we will also send you information in a follow-up email on how to access the recorded version of today's presentation. In addition, we will also send you continuing education information for those of you that qualify to receive 1 credit for attending today's presentation in its entirety. Thank you for attending today, and this concludes today's webinar. Everyone have a wonderful day.